Eastasia, the titan of the East, encompassing former China, Korea, and the land of the rising sun. It dominates Southeast Asia, a menace to both Eurasia and Oceania, yet it was not born with them, only emerging some years after. Today I shall briefly explain my theory, based on the law, of how 1984's youngest superpower came to be. Goldstein's book explains that Eastasia emerged around a decade after Eurasia and Oceania, so in the middle 1960s, and after a period of confused fighting. For me, this is actually crucial to understanding how the state likely emerged, as, for those who don't know, China at the time of Orwell's writing of the novel was still embroiled in its civil war. By 1948, the year of the novel's composition, the war was in the communists' favour, but the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek were still fighting in mainland China. Victory for Mao and the founding of the People's Republic of China would not happen until late 1949, after the novel's publication, so it's likely Orwell simply envisaged a prolonged conflict stretching into the 1960s. You'll note that I preclude the notion of a Japanese-led Eastasia. I doubt Orwell envisaged this for several reasons. Firstly, as Imperial Japan was broken long before the novel was penned, and once it had committed to war with the US, there's no feasible way it could have prevented its destruction as a potent enough military power to fully conquer China and eventually form Eastasia. While it's true that Japan had already conquered large parts of China during the Second World War and expanded its sphere to even threaten the likes of Australia at one point, the only way I can see Japan remaining powerful enough to go on to create Eastasia is if the USA did not prevent it. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was as a result of the American embargo that would have eventually crippled their military efforts regardless of any direct intervention. Only in a timeline with no US involvement could Japan have maintained a war and fought on to found Eastasia. A second law reason I reject the Japan-led theory is that the scant law we do have on Eastasia heavily implies a Chinese-led formation. Note in Goldstein's book how the death worship ideology, or more precisely, simply a near-identical reiteration of the oligarchical collectivism practiced by its rivals, was more accurately known by a Chinese name, translated as obliteration of the South. History buffs will recall that Imperial Japan was very aggressive in promoting both Japanese culture and language within its empire, with notable examples including in occupied Korea and Taiwan. I therefore find it difficult to believe that the Japanese-led Eastasia would have had as its lingua franca a Chinese language like Mandarin or Cantonese. Indeed, a final reason I reject this theory is the incompatibility of Imperial Japan with Eastasia itself. Another thing we are certain of in the law is that the ideological framework of each superstate is near identical, and we can also safely assume that since we know Oceania at least nominally claims to adhere to socialist principles, as does the neo-Bolshevik regime in Eurasia, that the Eastasia party equivalent and ideology will also be socialist in nature too. Even very casual history enthusiasts will know that one thing socialist regimes aren't are royalists, and one thing the ultra-nationalist Imperial Japanese were fanatically devoted to their emperor. While an Eastasia ruled by an imperial big brother is a fascinating idea then, it's highly improbable given the law. The scenario that makes the most sense is that the Civil War perhaps extended for a few years beyond our timeline. This makes sense given the general chaos of the wider world. In 1954, we know the atomic war broke out in-universe, with hundreds of bombs falling in Western Europe, European Russia, and North America. Even assuming events roughly panned out the same up to this point in-universe as in our world, it's likely the US was forced to withdraw from places like Japan and Korea. In our world, even to the present, or at least as of recording anyway, the United States maintains a military presence in both South Korea and Japan. In Orwell's world, with the devastation of the atomic war and then the subsequent civil war, along with the wider conflict with Eurasia, was very likely more than enough to leave the battered Korean peninsula and the Japanese islands open to PRC conquest. You may be thinking that the time between the Atomic War and the rise of Eastasia was around a decade, so couldn't Oceania, the successor of the United States, retake these places, if indeed they were ever forced to withdraw from them? Well, possibly. I'm only theorising what likely happened given what we know. Oceania is a massive globe-spanning empire that easily dwarfs even the British Empire of our history in the real world, and even Eurasia, its nearest rival in universe. In terms of territory claimed, it's by far the largest empire to exist in its world, encompassing approximately 38% of the world's land area, which, to place that in perspective, the British Empire, the real world's largest empire ever, only encompassed around a quarter of the land area of the globe. My point is that militarily, and especially culturally speaking, it may simply have been more trouble than it was worth to hold these places. We know from the law that each power adheres to core territories, and especially in Oceania, there's a broad cultural homogeneity, at least mostly, with its lands largely made of the former Anglosphere countries, and with the Latin areas of South America, of course, being the exception. With Eurasia, yes, while there are a myriad of different cultures and languages, a Russia-led Eurasia still makes more sense in terms of a Eurosphere than, say, a Japanese or Chinese-dominated Eurasia. By the same token, the effort of culturally and linguistically assimilating Japan, Korea, and other Southeast Asian territories would have been difficult, as it even admits in-universe in Goldstein's book. This is why I believe Oceania likely had no real ambition to occupy these future core East Asian territories. Add into all of this the newly limited scale of professional armed forces, the damage caused by both the atomic and then civil wars, the continuing conflict between the larger enemy states, as well as the huge population of the area in question, and its own hardened veteran armies, and you can see why both Oceania and Eurasia likely stayed well away while the Chinese, in one form or another, settled their own power struggles until settling into Eastasia by the middle 1960s. Just in case you're wondering why Eurasia never attempted to incorporate parts of or all of future East Asian lands into it, well, similarly to Oceania, it had way too much on its plate. Eurasia formed from the USSR's absorption of Europe and other areas, which, along with its own likely heavy damage from the Atomic War, subsequent rebellions, civil war, and continuing war with Oceania, meant it was in no fit state to also contest Manchuria or other areas with the aggressive and war-hardened Chinese powers, and then the unified state of Eastasia. Back on those aggressive Chinese powers, I said earlier on, in one form or another, in settling their own affairs, as one answer to the "why did the Chinese Civil War extend for so much longer" question is that it didn't. Logically applying what I call the mirror theory of the superstates, just as all the superpowers are nominally socialist, all adhere to the oligarchical collectivist model, have the same pyramidal structure and the same worship of a semi-divine infallible leader, so too did Eastasia have its own civil war, where its own high, very likely the leaders of the Communist Party under Mao, was ousted and replaced by its ambitious middle to form a new and final high. While not based on anything in particular, I have a fun theory that perhaps there was an in-universe version of the Cultural Revolution in which Mao used the enthusiastic, spy-like youth to purge the old guard of the Communist Party and effectively create his new inner party under him. Mao, of course, is already very Big Brother-like, with his own real-world cult of personality and central place in Communist Party and modern Chinese history. Since Orwell could never have known what would happen in 1966 onwards in our world, I'm not in any way suggesting this was what he actually imagined. After all, Orwell was a great writer, not Nostradamus. Whether or not Mao was the BB figure of Eastasia, I think there are grounds then to conclude the following as a feasible theory, given history, common sense, and the law. The Chinese Civil War lasted some years after the formation of the other powers. Given the socialist nature of Eastasia, this means that logically it was Mao and the communists who emerged victorious here. However, I think another, final civil war could have erupted too, perhaps in the 1960s itself, this separate conflict resulting in the PRC's high being overthrown by its ambitious middle. Whether Japan and Korea had been annexed before this final revolution is up for debate. However, whether before or after, a new elite did seize power and formed its state along oligarchical collectivist lines. It also had its pyramidal structure and BB equivalent. Exactly who this was, or if they even existed, is unknown. Mao is a possibility, while Hirohito or Chiang Kai-shek are very unlikely for reasons we've already considered. With Eastasia's final emergence in the 1960s, the other two superpowers now had a third power to balance things out. Eastasia would now forever threaten Eurasia's eastern flank, whilst also conceivably threatening oceanic Australia, New Zealand and its territories in Southeast Asia, settling the final circumstances of the perpetual war that we're all familiar with. So that was my theory on how and who formed Eastasia in George Orwell's 1984. I can't wait to see what you all think. I'm sure many of you have your own thoughts, objections and theories, so be sure to write them in the comments section, as I do try to read them all. Thanks for listening, and if you thought the video was plus good, then bash those like and subscribe buttons if you haven't done so already. If double plus good, then check out channel memberships for early access to new videos and exclusive access to members-only podcasts. Finally, remember, Oceania has always been at war with Eastasia since the beginning of your life, since the beginning of the party, since the beginning of history. The war has continued without a break. Always the same war. Do you remember that?